In the 1930s, the federal government began to support the expansion of American homeownership. The government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation, also known as HOLC, drew color-coded maps for every metropolitan area in the country to show which neighborhoods were best fit for investment. The maps classified neighborhoods by their perceived level of desirability and sought to imply that providing loans and mortgages to people in less desirable areas were unwise investments. HOLC manufactured these maps and based neighborhood desirability levels largely on their racial and ethnic compositions. Neighborhoods home to African Americans and immigrants from Japan, China, Mexico, and countries in Eastern Europe were deemed hazardous and colored red due to their so-called adverse racial concentrations. For example, Area D3 on San Francisco's redlining map outlines the Fillmore District, a historically black and low-income neighborhood that was described in HOLC's report as, quote, a constant threat of undesirable racial infiltration, unquote, to the surrounding neighborhoods. D3 was given the worst grade by HOLC, hazardous. In contrast, predominantly white neighborhoods were given higher grades of desirability, colored green and blue on the map. These grades enabled residents to easily access loans, and these areas saw increased investment. Meanwhile, residents in so-called hazardous areas like D3 were unable to secure loans to buy property or to fix up existing structures. This led to a vicious cycle of disinvestment that greatly impacted the future prospects of these neighborhoods. This racialized system of investment is known today as redlining, named for the neighborhoods colored in red, which were most harmed by this purposefully inequitable policy. This is the original redlining map of San Francisco. Green areas were those deemed first grade or best. Blue areas were those deemed second grade or still desirable. Yellow areas were those deemed third grade or definitely declining. And red areas were those deemed fourth grade or hazardous. By encouraging urban investment in some neighborhoods and disinvestment in others, based largely on ethnic composition, redlining contributed to racial segregation and eventual white flight to the suburbs. It also solidified a homeownership and wealth gap between white people and people of color that persists to this day. Today, U.S. cities are undergoing a profound shift, marked by increased demand to live near city centers, renewed investment in previously disinvested areas, and skyrocketing rental and housing costs. Considering this history of urban investment, we must ask, who is included or excluded within this new era of urban restructuring? Who benefits and who loses? Many of the neighborhoods previously redlined are now undergoing gentrification, a process of neighborhood change that includes economic and demographic shifts in historically disinvested neighborhoods. These changes result from real estate investment and an influx of higher-income residents. Gentrification often leads to improved amenities and resources catering to newcomers and displacement pressures on long-term residents. When long-term residents are pushed out, they are unable to benefit from this renewed investment. Displacement has profound effects for the economic, social, physical, and emotional well-being of families. By contrast, many neighborhoods historically home to higher-income white residents have continued to exclude low-income and people of color, often due to lack of affordability and opposition to the development of affordable housing. The history of redlining and the contemporary processes of gentrification, displacement, and exclusion are so deeply intertwined that it is not surprising that present-day patterns resemble the same outlines of the redlining maps from the 1930s. This is a map of gentrification and exclusion in San Francisco. Orange represents stages of residential exclusion of lower-income people. Purple represents stages of gentrification and low-income displacement. Notice the overlap. Today's gentrifying low-income neighborhoods are predominantly the same neighborhoods that were redlined and denied investment and homeownership in the 1930s. In fact, 87% of today's gentrifying areas were rated as hazardous in red in the 1930s. Similarly, areas that today exclude low-income households by means of insufficient affordable housing or rental buildings are predominantly areas that were classified as desirable in green and blue in the 1930s. In fact, 45% of today's exclusionary areas were rated as lower risk in green or blue. Understanding the history behind current urban challenges is both sobering and instructive. Current conditions were shaped by decades of purposeful policies and practices with an intentional focus on race and ethnicity. Today's solutions must take a similarly long view and racial lens to make meaningful, equitable change. Visit urbandisplacement.org to learn more about our maps, resources, and research.